Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. Since we're picking up after a lot of chalice dungeoneering though, I thought I'd start things off this time with an update on how my character setup has changed. Ultimately, I gained more than 50 levels, taking me from 117 in the last episode of Translationborne to 173 in this one. As a result, not only was I able to get my strength to 50 to complete my strength arcane build, but I also managed to raise my other stats so that I now meet the minimum requirement to use every weapon in the game. In fact, I gained even more levels than I needed for that, allowing me to keep boosting my arcane to 60. This makes me beyond over-leveled for this point in the main game, which most players finish somewhere around level 80, but after the experience I had with the chalices, I'm about ready for things to be easy for a while. And importantly, it's not just my high level that will help lower the difficulty. I also have 2 maxed out weapons now, boasting some incredibly powerful cursed blood gems. Of course, this doesn't actually change much about my overall weapon strategy. The idea is still to attack beasts with my flame-imbued saw cleaver, while fighting other enemies with the tonitrus. But I have also grown more accustomed to using the executioner's gloves in a wider variety of situations. Still, there's more to the chalice dungeons than powerful gems and an obscene amount of blood echoes. I also picked up a number of items that can only be found by exploring them, and I hope to go over these in detail as we continue to make progress. Speaking of which, I should note that our route involves checking in on a couple surviving NPCs before heading to the DLC. But first, a word from the doll.
O Flora, of the moon, of the dream. O little ones, O fleeting will of the ancients. Let the hunter be safe, let him find comfort, and let this dream, his captor, foretell a pleasant awakening. Be one day a fond, distant memory.
Nice to know how much the doll cares about us, isn't it? But what really strikes me about this translation is the way it captures the specific form of the doll's expression. These lines are meant to be a kind of prayer. You can see this in the Japanese, both in the general structure, with the doll calling for the attention of a variety of beings before making a series of humble requests, and in the grammatical form of the final word, narimasu yoni. This masu yoni ending indicates the speaker's hope or wish for the future, and is commonly used in prayers. English doesn't have this same grammatical tell though, so the translators need to rely on different conventions to get across the tone and atmosphere of a prayerful entreaty. Crucially, you can see them doing this right in the first line, which literally is no more than a string of nouns modifying one another. Flora of the moon of the dream. Left in this form, it's not only unclear that the doll is calling out to Flora, but it's also hard to tell that this is the start of a prayer. To address this, the translators have made 2 key changes. First, they've added the word O at the start, which clarifies that the doll is speaking to Flora, and indicates that some amount of supplication is involved. Second, and more importantly, they've added in a couple of commas, changing Flora of the moon of the dream into O Flora of the moon of the dream. This creates a lilting cadence that both builds a sense of awe and mirrors the 2-part structure of the following line. Taken together, these changes make the official translation sound like a prayer, albeit not one that helped me survive that fall. As appropriate as I find the official wording though, it does involve something of a trade-off. That's because while both the descriptors of the moon and of the dream still obviously apply to Flora, it's less clear how these terms interact with each other. Players may well come away with the understanding that Flora is of the moon in the real world as well as of the dream, whereas the more literal string of modifiers, Flora of the moon of the dream, seems to point more directly to Flora being of the dream moon. In a sense, then, what we're seeing is the choice of a translation that best fits the style of a prayer, as opposed to one that prioritizes literal information. This tension between form and content is a dilemma that often comes up in translation, and it's always tricky to resolve because both are important. Having said that, in this case I think the potential ambiguity introduced by the official translation is a small price to pay for how well it works as the opening line of a prayer, but I still wanted to highlight this decision as an example of that creative tension. At the same time, it's worth pointing out that there are a number of creative choices on display here that involve no such conflict. Beginning each of the doll's requests with the word let, for instance, perfectly fits the form of a prayer while also suiting the content of each line. Or, for an example that involves more interpretation, simplifying the idea of the dream becoming a portent of a kind awakening into it foretelling a pleasant awakening strikes me as a great way to more naturally convey the same concept. Perhaps my favorite interpretive choice, though, comes in the wording of the final line. The doll only says it if we've given her the small hair ornament, and in Japanese it involves the word懐かしい. In literal translation, this term is often represented using some form of the word nostalgia, though as I discussed in Translationborne 55, the core idea is of being drawn to something out of a sense of familiarity and fondness. In other words, having the doll wish that the dream will be for us a fond, distant memory cuts straight to the heart of what she wants to express. At the same time, it fits what she would have learned from receiving the hair ornament, because that experience taught her what it's like to have a fond, distant memory. Finally, by invoking the far future, this line also feels like a suitable end to her prayer. It's a really impressive translation that manages to accomplish several things all at once. But despite my fondness for the translation of this set of lines in general, there's one potential double meaning I think works better in Japanese. At the start of the prayer, the doll addresses three beings or groups of beings. The first, as we've discussed, is Flora. The second would literally translate to something like little them, but we know from a previous dialogue that this is the doll's way of referring to the messengers. The third addressee, though, is harder to pin down. In Japanese, the relevant phrase is furui ishi no tadayoi, and two of the three key terms here are challenging to work out. Furui, the first word, is the easy one. It means old or ancient, and it's directly modifying the next word, ishi. That might sound familiar to you, especially if you recall that the Japanese term for blood echoes is chi no ishi, but in this case the kanji involved make it clear that this is actually a homonym. To get a sense of this, think of the English word will. The term used in blood echoes has a similar meaning to the will in last will and testament, whereas the word the doll speaks in prayer is closer to that in the phrase sheer force of will. And if you can still see a potential connection between those two senses of the word will, well, I feel the same way about the Japanese. We've actually heard the doll use the expression furui ishi before, when the doll muses to herself that hunters are truly those who inherit past wills. Here, even the official translation has her reference ancient echoes, and as I discuss in Translationborne 55, my ultimate understanding of that dialogue is that by taking on the will of the slain, that is, by using blood echoes to level up, our presence comes to resemble those who've gone before, which the doll perceives as familiar and comforting. This means there's a sense in which the doll can be seen as addressing the wills of the dead in her prayer, albeit those that aren't born by blood. It's also where the third and final key term comes in. Tadayoi is the noun form of the verb tadayou, and it's what the phrase furui ishi is modifying. It can describe slow movement through air or water, a sensation that fills a given space, or the physical act of wandering. And frustratingly, this range of meanings makes it unclear whether the doll is addressing a flow of ancient wills, or their lingering presence. By the former interpretation, the official translation of fleeting will of the ancients makes sense. After all, anything fleeting is here one moment and gone the next, which implies a kind of motion. It's also a term that's associated with mortality, calling to mind spirits of the dead. By the latter interpretation of the Japanese, though, fleeting seems out of place. It makes it sound like these ancient wills are transient, as opposed to implying that they linger in nightmare realms such as the hunter's dream. And I find that worth considering because how the spirits of the dead in nightmares interact is quite relevant to where we're headed.
Cursed fiends, their children too. And their children forever true.
Right, don't worry about that cryptic voice for now. First, I'd like to focus on the location we're being teleported to thanks to the eye of the blood-drunk hunter, the hunter's nightmare. Of course, we'll learn more about the place as we head out and explore, but one aspect of it that we can appreciate right away is its name, which manages to be both simple and complex at the same time. Its simplicity lies in its meaning. Karyudo no Akumu quite literally works out to Nightmare of the Hunter or Hunters, and it's clearly meant to contrast with the name of the Hunter's Dream, or Karyudo no Yume. Yet that very tie to the dream and the terms associated with it also lend the name complexity, especially in Japanese. That's because, as I discussed in Translationborne 54, in the original language, the hunter's dream is frequently referred to as a nightmare. There's even a note that provides instructions on how to escape this accursed hunter's nightmare, meaning the hunter's dream, right at the start of the game. Fortunately, though, the official English manages to avoid any potential confusion on this point, since the translation refers to this dreadful hunter's dream instead. Given that this decision was probably made before the creation of the DLC, I imagine the translators breathed a sigh of relief when they saw this name come up and realized they didn't have to worry about any pre-existing references to the hunter's nightmare. The downside, of course, is that it's harder to identify the hunter's dream as a nightmare realm in English, but that's an issue that involves more than just that one note. Speaking of larger issues, though, I think it's time we return to the subject of those voiced lines we heard while being teleported here, because for all their brevity, there's a lot going on with them, including a subtle reinforcement and expansion of our understanding of how curses work. Admittedly, we don't know a whole lot about curses, but the Defiled Chalice does tell us that they're linked with the wrath of the Great Ones and are called maledictions, a word I use deliberately to emphasize an association with incantations in the Japanese term juso. Based on this, there's a sense in which curses can be understood as using the spoken word to direct the anger of the Great Ones, which is particularly relevant to this dialogue because it is in fact an excerpt from a chant that you can sort of hear later in the DLC. Now, I'm not going to go over that chant in detail, partly because it's a little early, and partly because it's so hard to hear in-game that the only reason it's actually intelligible is due to data mining. But I do think it's worth noting that this is clearly meant to be a way of channeling the wrath of the Great Ones to bring suffering to others. In other words, it fits the definition we have of a curse, which is something I think the official translation handles exceedingly well. To see this, consider all the things this short set of lines needs to accomplish. First of all, because this voiceover is featured when the player is teleported into the hunter's nightmare, it needs to be able both to stand on its own and to work in the larger context of the chant. Second, it has to sound like some sort of incantation in English, since if players don't recognize its form, they won't be able to see what's going on. Third and finally, it needs to get across the proper meaning of the Japanese, like any other translation. That's a pretty tall order, but I think the end result is a success. Yes, a small amount of information is lost by cutting the dakara, or therefore, from the beginning, but this allows the translation to stand alone while still making sense in the full chant. Meanwhile, making this pair of lines rhyme clearly sets them apart from ordinary speech, and makes them feel like a chant. Finally, in terms of meaning, the translation accurately conveys the idea of the speaker cursing a group of people they have great distaste for unto endless generations. True, the wording is different, but it kind of has to be. If you look at my more literal version of these lines, you'll notice that they're not just disjointed, but there isn't a single verb between them. In Japanese, this works because the grammatical particle wo identifies noroi no koe, or the baneful voices, as the direct object of an implied verb. And since Japanese is a high-context language, there's no need to spell out that implication. In English, though, not only are there no grammatical particles to work with, but it's highly unusual to imply a verb. Given the intent behind these cursing voices, then, I think changing "for the people we dislike, the baneful voices" to "curse the fiends" makes sense, even without considering the way that curses work in Bloodborne. Of course, there are reasons besides calling down curses to contact the Great Ones, and as this next item shows, many different groups are trying to communicate with them. Cage of Mensis, the Mensis school faction which presides over the Hidden Ward, a hexagonal prism-shaped iron cage which symbolizes its strange methods. This cage regulates the will, and is also a device for gaining objectivity regarding the mundane world. At the same time, it is also an antenna for communicating with higher rank ones of dreams. And, in reality, this guided them to the nightmare which they longed for. So, as usual, there's a lot going on with this description, but for now I want to stay focused on the idea of making contact with the Great Ones. It's a concept we've seen before, and in the Japanese, there's a particular term, koushin, that keeps coming up in relation to it. As I discussed in Translationborne 66, the word is associated with wireless communication, particularly via radio. In Bloodborne, it's used to describe the unfulfilled goal of the choir's ritual, A Call Beyond, and it's the name of a gesture that we've used to have a back and forth with the Great One, make contact. Now we're seeing it again in the context of the School of Mensis reaching out to the Great Ones through their strange headgear. Notably, the official English uses the term contact in all three of these cases, and since in ham radio terminology this specifies a call and response, I think it does a good job of paralleling the subtle associations at work in the Japanese. In the case of the Mensis Cage, though, there's one additional aspect of the English that I think makes this radio connection work even better than in the original. It all comes down to the two senses of the English word antenna, which can either refer to the feelers that extend from the heads of insects, or to a device used to transmit as well as receive radio waves. By contrast, the Japanese term shokaku has just a single definition in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary, one that's related to insect feelers. In Japanese, to refer to the communication device, the word antenna is used instead. In other words, if we're being very literal, the Mensis Cage is being described as an insectal antenna for communicating with the Great Ones. Of course, this doesn't make any practical sense, but it does provide an organic analogy for sending and receiving signals in a way that prominently features the sense of smell, even as the radio-associated term koushin gives us a more mechanical metaphor. What's great about the English word antenna, then, is that it works in both contexts, combining the biological and technological senses into a single word. It's a rare instance where a double meaning in the English, rather than the Japanese, can be used to further our understanding of what's going on. While we may have a strong sense that aerial correspondence is taking place between humans and Great Ones, though, things get a lot less clear when it comes to identifying which of the Great Ones Mensis is communicating with. All we have to go on here is the Japanese phrase yume no joisha, which might seem straightforward enough, but between the lack of clear plurals and the absence of grammatical articles in Japanese, it could actually be understood in a wide variety of ways. For instance, is Mensis specifically dealing with the Great One of the Dream here, or Great Ones of Dreams more generally? In English, this ambiguity needs to be resolved in order to construct a proper sentence, whereas the Japanese can remain vague. It's a dilemma that we've seen before, and so for my more literal version, I've followed my typical approach of trying to leave things as open as possible. Meanwhile, the official translators seem to have adopted a similar solution to the one they used in the description of the moon rune, leaving the dream as a single definite location and pluralizing Great Ones. While I don't blame the translators for going with that particular wording, though, there is one set of translation choices in this description that I don't quite follow. Specifically, I have a hard time understanding the interpretive decisions that went into the final English line. There are three choices I find perplexing here, though one of them makes more sense to me than the others. That would be the introduction of an outside perspective in the phrase to an observer, because while the Japanese makes no specific allusion to an outsider, it does employ the term jisai ni. This is a way of saying that something has happened in actual fact, that it's not in any way theoretical or some sort of exaggeration. I've more literally translated this as in reality, but I think you can see how the overall effect of using this phrase is similar to the introduction of an observer. In both cases, there's an appeal being made to a more objective viewpoint, a way of saying that whatever theoretical connection to Great Ones and dreams this item may have, it undeniably is what led Mensis to the nightmare. Even so, introducing this observer is an unusual approach, and it gets even weirder with the inclusion of the phrase appears to be. The Japanese doesn't involve speculation of any kind, and this is a language that has plenty of ways to verbally indicate uncertainty, supposition, or hearsay. So why is there this extra layer of speculation in the English? Well, perhaps the translators felt like they couldn't provide omniscient information because they added in this outside observer, though in that case it makes more sense to me to get rid of the observer rather than to introduce further uncertainty. Alternatively, this may be another instance of outdated English text, which would also explain why the official translation describes the nightmare as harrowing when there's no equivalent term in the original. Instead, the word that's directly modifying akumu, or nightmare, is nozomu, which typically means to hope or long for something. Now, it does have an additional meaning of to gaze at from afar that might be part of the confusion here, but I can't see that interpretation fitting in this context. Again, I find the translation of this entire last line perplexing, and I suspect it may have been altered at some point in the Japanese. But rather than leave off on that note, let's conclude with another interpretive decision that I admire. At one point in my literal version, I say that the Mensis Cage regulates the will, which is more neutral than the official restrains the will of the self. However, the relevant definition of the Japanese verb disuru specifically involves keeping things within limits, and is associated with self-control. Given that, I think the official translation does a great job conveying these underlying aspects of the Japanese, with the added bonus of expressing this in a way that fits this item being an actual cage. And that, I think, is a much better point to go out on. Before I sign off, though, let me note that you can find a link to the Translationborne index in the description, which should be updated to reflect the contents of this episode within 24 hours of it going live. If you're not sure what that is, you might want to check out my latest channel update for a quick explanation. Otherwise, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, please let me know. Until next time then, thanks for watching, everyone.